Podot. Welcome to A Pod Too Far, the new podcast where we relive 1980s Sunday afternoons spent watching old war movies. No Dolby Atmos, no CGI, often no colour film stock, just stiff upper lips, do-or-die missions, and your dad muttering that he really ought to stop watching this nonsense and mow the lawn. I'm Rob Hutton. I write jokes about politics and books about wartime history and espionage, and my co-host is Duncan Weldon.
I'm an economist. I write books about economics and history, and I've watched far too many war films.
And you also paint, I think, small model men.
We're going there first episode. We're going there. We're shaming Duncan about hobbies straight away.
Why is Duncan here? Because Duncan paints little models of men.
I also have an A level in media studies, which is very relevant.
So today we're going to kick off with the big one. Bridge Too Far, Richard Attenborough's 1977 epic of Operation Market Garden. Market's the airborne element, garden, that's the ground element. Duncan, when did you first see this film? Any idea when you first saw this film?
I must have first seen this film at some point in, I would guess, the late 1980s. It's probably the film that I've seen the most. I mean, I must have seen this film a dozen times, and, it's 3 hours long. That's days of my life. A day and a half of my life I've spent watching this film. It's the perfect length to get you a train journey from King's Cross to Newcastle. Top tip there.
Right. So you just get off at the point at which Liv Ullmann is loading up her cart to go and find shelter.
The British have just failed to get to the bridges as you cross the Tyne Bridge. It's fantastic.
Oh, perfect. This film does seem to have a particular significance to, well, let's just say it, to middle-aged men.
So, I've been trying to think for the last few days, is this a good film or not? And do I like it or not? I've certainly seen it a lot. Do I like it a lot? Well, in some ways I do, but in some ways you sort of step back and it's in many ways, it's a dreadful film. It's got probably the best cast of any film made in the last 30 or 40 years. Just that movie poster, which is, line after line of all of these biggest stars of the day. It's got a huge budget. It's got a fantastic director. It's got what should be a really gripping story, and yet somehow it doesn't quite work. You never quite know if you're watching sort of, a war film or if you're watching sort of a dramatised documentary about Operation Market Garden.
So it did, in fact, get terrible, terrible reviews. The British liked it, the Americans hated it. William Goldman's book, Adventures in the Screen Trade, which, if you're at all interested in the history of cinema, is an absolute must-read, has a long section on making A Bridge Too Far. And what's interesting is basically he says he hated all parts of making films except working on A Bridge Too Far, which he just said was brilliant fun, until the moment that the critics dropped their reviews. As you say, there was this sort of all-star cast. It's Joseph Levine, who's the producer, has this brilliant idea to make it and basically to sell it as they're making it. The stars are part of that. He was an incredible showman, and he sort of understood that if he just sort of got distributors in as they were making it and showed them the rushes and look, here's Robert Redford, that everyone would go mad and just start buying it all. And so I think they were in fact in profit by the time they'd finished, which is apparently very, very unusual. The star they couldn't get is Steve McQueen, because there's a moment where Goldman and Levine and Attenborough, I think, go to Hollywood to cast Julian Cook, who becomes ultimately the Robert Redford character. And they basically, at that point,
the dashing American.
The dashing American. And they've got one good American part left. And they've got Steve McQueen and Robert Redford as the sort of the two possibles. And Steve McQueen's people say, you're never going to get Robert Redford. He's much too busy doing All the President's Men. And so you've got to have Steve, but you can only have Steve if you buy Steve's house. Because Steve can't sell his house, so Joseph Levine has to buy Steve's house. And you have to give, it's proper sort of entourage nonsense. You have to give jobs to 20 people, I don't know, who are coming with Steve McQueen, and they're dead.
So at this point, I want to revisit my podcast rider. Yes. That's a conversation we can have later.
Got a cup of tea, don't complain. They're just sort of squirming at this when they realise that they can get Redford. And sort of the McQueen, it becomes slightly Partridge-like. The McQueen offered, he doesn't need any of that really. And McQueen realises that he's missed this chance to be in this great film, and it is a great war film to have been in.
It's when you got the line of tank. You got the amazing airborne shots of the paradrop with hundreds or even thousands of extras jumping with parachutes. There's pre-CGI. If you want to film a massive airborne drop, you need to put aeroplanes in the sky and have hundreds of parachutists jumping out of them.
It's absolutely insane. And and you need tanks. And there's a row about whether they can film it. They either film it in Eastern Europe where there's lots of, like Romania or something, where they can get lots of tanks quite easily, or they can film it in Holland where the bridges are.
Yeah.
But the alternate location doesn't have any bridges. So you either go there and you have to build bridges to capture, or you do it in Holland where the bridges are, but you have to get the tanks.
Yeah.
It's a sort of mad but joyous kind of shoot. And apparently after he'd finished making it, Attenborough slept for about 3 days, just went to bed. And there's a brilliant bit where Goldman describes the tension that Attenborough as a director is under. There's this sort of, because they can close the Nijmegen Bridge for an hour each Sunday morning for filming, and that's the agreement they've got with the town council. And so that's when they have to film Redford crossing the bridge. And if they don't get this shot this Sunday, they have to keep Redford for another week so that they can try it again next Sunday, and that will cost them $1 million. It's called the $1 Million Hour, and it's just this amazing description of Attenborough sort of standing there with everyone buzzing around him and sort of asking him questions about the next shoot, and is the smoke okay, and are those tanks all right, and all of this sort of thing. And he's going around telling all the extras have got to keep their eyes shut if they're dead, because you can't have any eyeballs moving. If anyone blinks, that's it. So if you're dead, please shut your eyes. And they get it. And Goldman just says is just in awe of Attenborough at the end of this. It's not clear to what extent Attenborough was actually invested in it. I think really he was doing this so that he could make Gandhi, which is the film that he really cared about. His other war film, which is Oh, What a Lovely War, is a completely anti-war film. It's a sort of musical that doesn't quite work about the First World War, but Attenborough is not, he's not one of these sort of Don Simpson types who is desperate to make films about people blowing people up against glorious sunsets and this kind of thing. He is personally quite anti-war, but he's sort of agreed to do this because Levine thinks he can do the epic stuff. The film opens with this line, and I have a question for you in your wearing your historian hat. Is, in fact, as Liv Ullmann claims, the war still going Hitler's way at the start of 1944?
Well, that's quite a stretch of the war is still going Hitler's way. So it's a good way of setting up the tales. Forget about completely, as lots of Western war movies do, what's happening on the much bigger Eastern Front, where the German army is by now, late 1944, in complete retreat, in fact defending old German territory in East Prussia. What's happening in the West is, the landings have happened, the Normandy landings. There's then been this bloody 6 or 8 week campaign in Normandy in June and July. The Allies have finally broken out of Normandy. The German army is in retreat. Now, where you can say the war is going slightly more the Germans' way is that, what actually happens in sort of late August, September 1944 on the Western Front is that the German army is able to somehow pick itself up, dust itself down, and reform a new defensive line. They're losing, but they're not losing as badly as they were a few weeks before. And Market Garden, that the film's about. And I think the film really is a film about Operation Market Garden. It's not a story about people involved in Market Garden. The individual characters are all sort of almost bit players, and there's very little sort of no characters you follow through the entire campaign in that same way.
No, and you don't know about any of their private lives. Are they married? Who are they leaving behind them? Yeah. It's absolutely none of that.
Yeah. I mean, the film is the story of Operation Market Garden, which is this sort of ridiculously ambitious plan to drop thousands of parachutists, British and American and Polish, to capture key bridges, and then a big armoured advance to link up to them.
Now, Operation Market Garden is Monty's plan. Was it a good plan?
If you're judging it by what happened, no. But I think even beyond that, no, it wasn't a good plan. There's a great story in Anthony Beevor's book about Arnhem, which is when they were planning this, Now, obviously, there's a lot of sort of Dutch military officers hanging around London who've made it out of the Netherlands before it's conquered in 1940. They're planning this major airborne and land operation in the Netherlands. You might think it was worth talking to the Dutch in advance.
I would.
Well, apparently this didn't happen. And the core part of the plan is driving an armoured division, 30 Corps, down this road, which becomes known as Hell's Highway, which is very narrow and is really not the road one would pick to drive an entire armoured division down at speed. And apparently in sort of the pre-war Dutch staff college, they used to, do all of these exercises, and pledging to use this specific road was sort of an automatic fail, that you haven't thought about this enough. So no, it's a bad plan. And the film, I think, is really quite good at reflecting that it was a bad plan. What is interesting about the film is, it's Monty's plan.
Yeah.
And yet Monty is sort of strangely absent from the film.
Yes, we'll come back to Monty's absence, I think. But yes, there's this fantastic moment where Michael Caine, relatively early in the operation, sort of says to one of his soldiers, well, you see the road here, this is the wide part. It's going to get worse up ahead. Right, so what we do in this podcast is we go through a sort of a series of categories in what we call our after action report. And the first of these categories is Quick Dad, they're on the cable car. What is the moment in this film that you call people in to watch? I mean, actually, for me, I realised that literally the opening titles. If my children did not call me in from the other room because they turned on the TV and the music was playing, I would be quite upset. Yeah, my children claim that all of these films have the same theme tune, but
they're variations on a theme, I think.
They're all military marches. I think the music for this is fantastic. I mean, it's then really interesting to me that you've got a blockbuster film made for the mass British and American market, and the first few minutes are entirely people speaking Dutch and people speaking German.
Yeah.
We're having no concession.
No, it's really much starting as they mean to carry on, I think, the sort of statement of...
If you're bothered by the fact that all the Germans are going to be speaking German to each other with subtitles, you just leave the cinema now.
You came for Robert Redford? Here's some people speaking Dutch. My bit I call people in for, which maybe... is why you shouldn't listen to me if I try and call you in to see an exciting bit of cinema. And I promise when we do other films, there'll be more exciting bits. But the bit I love is the briefing scene.
Right.
When, the British officers are being briefed on, here's going to be the plan. I think of this like one of those American...
Well, there's a horror
films.
speech. I think of this as one of these old-fashioned Western movies. I mean, which they just used in the trailer.
Yeah.
The great thing about that, again, going back to Goldman's anecdotes about this, he said he spent ages sort of with the Cornelius Ryan book. And Market Garden is this operation. I think there's 5 Victoria Crosses are awarded. There's so many amazing stories. And he's just sitting there trying to work out how to tell this story and couldn't work out how to tell this story. And then he finds himself looking at the Horrocks speech.
Yeah.
And he says, oh my goodness, this is the story. It's one of those old-fashioned Western films.
Yeah.
The Paras, they're the homesteaders.
Yeah.
The Nazis, well, they're the Indians closing in.
Yeah.
And 30 Corps, we're the cavalry on the way to the rescue. And once he understood that basically, as you say, the film is about Operation Market Garden, and it's will they make it? Yeah. Will they make it to Arnhem? Once he understood that, he said it was really easy, and he cut all the VCs. Yeah. So you don't see anyone winning their VC.
Again, it goes back to this is a film about Market Garden. This is not a film about people. But it's great, from a sort of director's point of view and a writer's point of view to find that speech sort of setting out the whole operation, because it's sort of, it's very early on in the film, and, you could write that as, now we're going to have some expositional dialogue to explain what's happening to our viewers.
Is that a real speech?
Well, it's there is a briefing. The Cowboys and Indians thing I'm not sure about, but using that sort of, device of, we all sit there and watch the British officers briefing. I think does just set up the story really well, and it's wonderfully done with sort of Michael Caine and...
So my next Quick Dad moment is James Caan. I didn't ask you how he was. I asked you where he was. that moment where you're going to get where Caan is going to slam his put his lieutenant into his Jeep and then drive through the German lines. Yeah. That for me is an absolute winner. The Bailey Bridge scene.
Yeah,
building a Bailey Bridge. Great music. Great Elliot Gould. More depressingly, the supply drop, which is the moment where I did have to warn my boys when we were watching this that this was going to be a sad bit. Sorry. I mean, but that is actually, I think that's the bit I remember from watching this whenever I watched it in the early 80s. That is the bit that sticks in your mind. And that is Attenborough's view of war.
Yeah.
Is simultaneous sort of moment of great heroism and pointless sacrifice.
Yeah.
More fun, the Germans wanting to discuss surrender. Was there anything else?
Just generally, Sean Connery as Frost being sort of lost.
Yes.
It's surprising. There's this bit when Sean Connery goes out to sort of reconnoiter the German lines and gets separated, and then just this, very much in the spirit of the film, just scene after scene of a lost Sean Connery trying to make his way back to the story, essentially.
What's the best way to take a bridge? Both ends at once. I love Redford in this. It would have been interesting to see the Steve McQueen version of this, but Redford, because it's not just the crossing, it's the keep going back to him, and he has to keep going back and telling his men, we're doing this. Well, the boat, we don't know if we have boats. We don't know what they're like. We do know that the river is wide and the current is strong. And actually, I think that one of the things, shortly after I watched this, I was in Liverpool for Labour conference, and I was looking at the Mersey, and you're suddenly thinking, right, this is because we're not talking about crossing small rivers.
Yeah,
in this, we are talking about crossing the kind of rivers that people drown
that need a big bridge over that's worth capturing.
And you can't you sort of, we'll row across it. It's not straightforward. And Redford does an incredible job with the pain, the moment where essentially he's being told you're probably going to die. You're going by day, better by day. Every now and then, at moments of real crisis in work, I would think to myself, better by day. It's around this point in the film, by the way, that my 13-year-old finally sort of perked up, pointed at Michael Caine and said, "Oh, he's from Batman," which is sort of. And then I think the final one, the final sort of scene you don't want to miss is the church tower, where they're discussing it. It was the bridge, it was the road. I think that's one of the other reasons why I love this film, is because you have these scenes where you've got these terrific actors with terrific scripts just going up against each other. So you've got Gene Hackman versus Dirk Bogarde versus Michael Caine, and they're all having a go. Yeah, most films you might have two of those guys.
Well, it is an unbelievable cast. You see it on the poster when they had to list them in alphabetical order.
Yeah,
because you can't rank these people against each other.
Next category, she's not so dumb. Are there any women in this film at all?
Well, there was a handful of speaking.
Six. I can tell you. I actually counted. There are 6 women, one of whom is the waitress at the start who gets a credit, but I'm not sure she actually has a spoken line. Several of them are just sort of credited as resistance wife.
Yeah,
it's quite a male film.
But it's just the nature of what happens if you make a film which is telling the story of the operation rather than the story of the people in the operation. So you don't, again, like you were saying, you don't even get to find out if characters have a wife at home or children. We just don't see any of that. So there are very, very few female roles. There was very narrowly, though, the Hepburn.
Right. So the one female role that there is Liv Ullmann. But tell us.
Yes, and they originally wanted to cast Audrey Hepburn. The interesting thing about Audrey Hepburn is, she was in Arnhem at the time as sort of a teenage girl, apparently working as a runner for the resistance, or certainly that was the later claim. So apparently one of the female teenage resistance characters we see could well be the actual real-life Audrey Hepburn. And there was this desire to cast, so you'd have, Audrey Hepburn playing someone who meets a young Audrey Hepburn, but sadly it didn't come off.
I mean, Liv
would have
Ullmann
been an excellent point for this.
It would have been an excellent point. Liv Ullmann is fine. I think we give it to Liv Ullmann. She's the best and only woman really in the film. The casualty list, the movie body count. I didn't do this, but according to the internet, it's 243 people are killed in this.
Film's about 180 minutes. Yeah. 1.3 a minute.
A bit more than 1 minute.
Yeah.
I think Operation Market Garden was pretty much more than 1 minute. In fact, what's the actual body count for the operation?
Okay, it looks like the actual casualties were something in the region of 4,000 dead, wounded or missing Americans, about 11 to 13,000 dead or wounded Brits and Poles, 6,500 captured, and between 7,500 and 10,000 German casualties. So yeah, more than 1 a minute.
The Cooler King Award for the most gratuitous American character. There were Americans in Market Garden, which makes it easier. But why is Elliot Gould in charge of building this bridge?
Yeah, very, very fair question. Very fair question. But this is the thing is, this was an Anglo-American operation. Two British airborne divisions, two American airborne divisions, independent Polish airborne brigade. Yes, it's a British ground force, but you're not short of actual American characters. You don't need to insert them quite so gratuitously.
James Caan. So the interesting thing about the James Caan incident, which is the moment where he holds a gun to a surgeon's head and asks him to treat his officer, who is presumed dead. The problem this film had when it was released in America was the critics just assumed it had been made up. Market Garden does not really sort of feature in the American mental map of the war. They sort of go from D-Day to the Battle of the Bulge, and they just thought, oh well, this is just the kind of thing that people make up to make it good. That story is basically all true. That story is true. The officer lived, lost his sight, but lived for decades after that. Unbelievably true. The thing about being put under arrest so the MP could count to 10 real fast. That's true, more or less. It's one of these ones where I keep checking that it's true because I find it so hard to believe, and you can see why. You can see why Goldman coming across it. And my final nominee for the Cooler King is Robert Redford shouting "tea." You're stopping for tea at 30 Corps.
It is a true fact, though, that British tanks in the Second World War, and indeed today, have the ability to make instant hot water for making tea.
Well, that's nice.
Yeah. American tanks don't have that. Might have other things British tanks can't make a cup of tea in them.
American submarines, though, could make Coca-Cola.
Really?
All through. Well, that was one of the things that the Gato class American submarine you're going on a 3-month patrol. Got to be able to make Coca-Cola. Right, and the final category is and introducing. Who's in this in a tiny part who went on to be a legend? And the problem is actually that they're basically all legends.
Yes, already.
At this point. Although arguably Sean Connery is in a bit of a dry spell at the point he's sort of come off Bond.
Yeah.
And I think it's around this point that he's prancing around in tiny, tiny Speedos for Zardoz or whatever it's called, if you've ever seen that one. But there is...
I haven't, and I'm not going to Google it.
No, don't. Do you remember the Adrian Mole TV series?
I do.
Adrian Mole's dad, Stephen Moore. Stephen Moore is the radio operator who says, "I'm not going to rock the boat."
There we go.
The desert. The thing about the desert, very dry. That's Adrian Mole's dad, who also played Marvin in the BBC adaptation of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I mean, if you're under 40 and you're listening to this, I'm sorry. I go and listen to something else.
Can I just absolutely clarify? You've asked for future stars, and you've gone for Adrian Mole's dad from an early 1980s TV series, and the guy that was Marvin in Hitchhiker.
They're both the same one.
But I feel our definition of star.
No, right. Okay. No. So Anthony Hopkins, though, actually, interestingly,
definitely a star.
Definitely, but not really a star at this point.
No, fair.
So this is sort of. I mean, he's on the fast track, which is why they give him the Colonel Frost role.
Yeah,
but this is kind of.
I feel Hopkins would have been a better choice to go with straight away.
Okay, than Adrian Mole's dad. I think the thing is that at the point at which I first watched it in the 80s, I was sitting there going, "That's Adrian Mole's dad," who at this point in the 80s was a sort of. Anyway, also Alan Armstrong. Who's sort of one of these British characters who you recognise is one of the soldiers with the flamethrower, and probably actually possibly the winner in this, Cliff from Cheers.
Oh, well, there you go.
John Ratzenberger. I don't think he has a speaking role, but he is one of Robert Redford's soldiers.
There we go.
He's bought it Sarge Award for the best death. There is a death a minute in this quite long film. My nominees are Ginger, who buys it at the supply drop. As I say, that stays in my mind. Old Dutch lady who's had enough of her house being blown up and goes out to try and hail a taxi. Dutch resistance son. I think one of my children refuse to watch anymore at this point. I mean, it's quite bad at that. Yeah. I don't know why this stuff didn't bother me when I was small. Possibly though, Major Harry Carlyle, who gets the one death monologue where Anthony Hopkins says, "Harry, I've always wanted to ask you, but didn't because I knew so much. You knew so much, very, very much wanted me to, and I didn't want you to give you the satisfaction. But why do you always carry that umbrella?"
Yes. And I'm with you. I think that the final one has to win it there.
Yes. Never could remember the password. Knew no Jerry would carry one. Had to prove I was an Englishman. You see. Which actually, I think you could say if you wanted a quote that sums up the film.
Yes.
Had to prove I was an Englishman. Again, I mean, I know I keep going about it, but it's so interesting that Market Garden is quite big in the British mental map of the war. It's actually one of the first war films made after the war is called Theirs Be the Glory, which is about Market Garden. It's basically about the battle for Arnhem, starring people who had fought at the Battle of Arnhem, fighting, I think, possibly in the place where they had fought. And it's made a year after the war or something. So for British people, I think Market Garden is huge, and it's a defeat. And Goldman found this sort of fascinating that the British are sort of so obsessed with.
But I mean, also Dunkirk, which also multiple
Dunkirk.
films on
yes.
it. Yeah,
yeah.
In fact, I think the British mental map of the war in the West goes something like Dunkirk, Battle of Britain, something in North Africa, D-Day, Arnhem, the end. And the British mental map ends at Arnhem.
Fair, yeah.
There's actually another 8-9 months until the end of the war, but it sort of stops it.
Yes,
after that, it somehow becomes an American story, I think, in the popular memory.
And that's just because the Yanks took over, or just because we like our defeats more?
I don't know. I think that's something pointless. And Market Garden is a British planned and executed operation. There's a lot of Americans there, but it's fundamentally a British plan, heavily reliant on British manpower. And the fact it goes wrong in, quite a poignant, dramatic way with, these powers cut off, having been dropped, having only expected to be there for a couple of days, having actually been fighting for days on end.
3 days, they said. We've been around.
Yeah. So I think I can see the dramatic appeal of it, but yeah.
Best meme. There is, so the one meme that has genuinely come out of...
Bring up the Piat.
Bring up the Piat.
Yeah.
Which you... Although I wonder whether anyone knows what that is who isn't people just like us, if you see what I mean.
It's hard to say. So, the line is when there's German armoured vehicles approaching, they shout, "Bring up the Piat." As I'm sure all of our listeners know.
All about, if you're still listening at this point, you will know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the Piat is the sort of shoulder-mounted British version of the bazooka in World War II. Personal Infantry Anti-Tank, I believe it stands for. Spigot-launched anti-tank shell, but there is a great bit of "Bring up the Piat."
The one I would like, there's a couple I would like to have the gif of. Field Marshal Model saying, when he sees the paratroopers land, he says, "There's nothing important here. I'm important. They must have landed here just to capture me." I mean, that's a sort of a fantastic moment of self-delusion. I would also quite like the Resistance dad saying, "Panic." Stiffest upper lip. Well, I've got Redford O'Neill discussing an Nijmegen bridge. In a series of things. Hopkins being offered a surrender, and Hopkins and Connery on the radio to each other. I don't know if it's a question of us coming to rescue you or you coming to rescue us. Oh. So the Hopkins surrender thing, again, there's this great anecdote. This is Colonel Frost. In the original script, the German crosses the bridge, says, "We wish to discuss terms of surrender," and the original script has Colonel Frost saying, "I'm terribly sorry, we can't possibly take you all prisoner." Yeah. Just this fantastic moment of stiff upper lip. Goldman is sort of on his way to shooting and is passing through London, and the real Colonel Frost says, "Can you meet me?" And he's shaking, and he says, "You can't make this film, this will destroy me." And Goldman can't understand. He says, "I didn't say that. Someone else said that. People will know that I didn't say that, and they will think I am trying to steal his glory." Oh. And so they had to rewrite, so they had to give it to this character, Harry Carlisle. That's the moment at which Goldman sort of thinks, "I'm not doing any more non-fiction." Because you're dealing with
real people of real memories, and
and you
libel.
You can absolutely understand if you were making this film, you're cutting characters. It's a great line. You want the line in. You're not having all of the names in it.
But that's also because of when it was made, isn't it? This is a film made 30, 35 years after the events depicted. I mean, I presume nowadays it is much easier to make those sorts of cuts for dramatic license for storytelling.
Yes, well, I mean, it's interesting. As we're recording this, Rogue Heroes, the SAS series, is on TV, which contains a great deal of dramatic license of the sort that you definitely would not be able to do if any of those people were still alive. Nastiest Nazi. I mean, maybe Hardy Kruger?
For want of a better phrase,
the SS man who basically can't understand why you would even be discussing terms of surrender. Why don't we just kill? Why don't we just kill them all? But so my nominee for Nastiest Nazi is Monty, who we don't see. Who I think probably the first couple of times I watched this, I thought Bogarde was Monty, and then I realized. And Bogarde is Boy Browning, who was dead at this point, but his wife was still alive, Daphne du Maurier, and she was furious about this. And I think there was some discussion about whether they could sue or whatever. There's lots of sort of because he becomes a cipher for stupid British officers sending men to their deaths.
Yeah. It's sort of the ghost at the feast. You know, this is an operation planned and conceived by Field Marshal Montgomery, for which he is really responsible for many of the aspects of the failure. But you're right, in the film, and I guess, you know, maybe the late 70s, it was too hard to do a film pointing out that this great British national hero had completely mucked this up. So Browning is sort of the substitute Monty. He was, you know, the failings are placed on his shoulders.
The Dambusters Dog Prize for the most problematic moment. I don't think there's a lot, but I'm not sure that if you were remaking this, they're not going to remake this, but if you were remaking this, I don't think you would have the lunatic asylum scene.
No, it just feels a bit gratuitous.
I'm sure that probably happened,
Yeah.
and probably that was what Urquhart said.
Yeah.
It's not a bad moment in the film, but it's the one moment where you thought,
Yeah.
you know, I'm not sure we... It's right, the Loose Lips Award for Best Lines. Bring the boys back home. Panic. The fantastic moment where the Germans are getting briefed on the situation. Air power, minimal. Everything minimal. It's all a question of bridges. And I think probably, I'm awfully sorry, but I'm afraid we're going to have to occupy your house. There is something of a war going on. But I think it's we can't accept your surrender.
Yeah, I think you're right.
We'd like to accept your surrender. We'd like to, but we can't accept your surrender. Was there anything else?
Yes.
He just sort of flatten Arnhem. Judgment at Nuremberg. How many war crimes are committed in the course of this film? I think there's civilians are shot.
Yeah.
Hardy Kruger isn't terribly interested in helping injured men get to hospital.
Yeah.
I think it's tricky. I think he probably gets away with it. I think he has to go to Uruguay, but so we've covered a lot of the stuff about the making of it. There's one other interesting thing about the making of it, which the other Goldman anecdote is that the crossing of the river to take the bridge at Nijmegen was described by witnesses as the single bravest moment of World War II. And specifically, what was described as the single bravest moment was the second crossing. And he had to cut it because he couldn't get it into the film. Because the first crossing, go across, which is what we see, and they're more or less killed, all of them. And then
second, I have to get and do the same thing, having just
watch this happen, and then get in boats and go.
Yeah,
and he said he spent ages trying to work out if there was a way that he could do this.
Yeah,
before realizing that he just couldn't. Is this the operation that changed the course of World War II?
No. Had it worked, it would have almost certainly shortened the war by months. You know, had they managed to get across the Rhine at that point, then the war would have been a lot shorter, and you know, maybe the boundaries of East and West Germany.
Yes, right. So the Allies, as it were, the goody Allies get to Berlin.
Yes. Quicker. Yeah, but sadly not.
Worth dying for. How does this film stand up on repeated viewing?
Well, as someone that's watched it many times, I have this strange relationship with it. I will watch it again next year because you know that's just what I do.
Going to Newcastle.
Yeah, exactly. Great Newcastle. I'll be watching it, but look, it does stand up to repeated viewing, but I'm still not sure it's a good film.
We won't be quoting Conservative Prime Ministers a lot during this podcast, but there is an absolutely fantastic quote from David Cameron about this film, which is that he watches it about once a year, like you. I don't know if he's going to Newcastle as well. Probably not. He says, I watch A Bridge Too Far, still hoping that if I watch it again, they'll take Arnhem. And that is exactly how I feel about it. I every time I watch it, you're just thinking, oh, maybe
this time's
going so well. You know, they built the Bailey Bridge, they've got over Nijmegen, and it hasn't blown up. That was A Pod Too Far with me, Robert Hutton, and Duncan Weldon. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe, and if you liked it, rate and review us. You can drop us a line at podtoofar@gmail.com or on Twitter @podtoofar. Next time, we're doing the greatest film about football ever made, Escape to Victory.